Son, this company now belongs to me. I spoke the words slowly, each syllable landing like a hammer on the long walnut conference table that stretched across the room. The sound echoed in the vast cold space as if the glass walls themselves reflected it back, filling the air with a heavy aftertaste. In that moment, I saw my son's eyes widen, then blink rapidly, as though trying to process what I had just said. He sat there in the high-backed black leather chair, the same one I had once tried out on the day the company was founded, when it was still just a small project in my garage on the outskirts of New Jersey. Now the recessed LED lights shone down their cold white beams, cutting into every angle of his face, exposing the shock and a flicker of panic. He was dressed in an impeccable navy blue suit, his Italian silk tie folded perfectly. But no suit could hide the truth. The power had slipped from his hands and landed in mine. I sat at the head of the table, my new chairman's chair, just a little taller than the rest. In front of me sat an espresso long gone cold. Its steam vanished, leaving only the dense aroma of coffee threading through the tense air. To my left, a few major shareholders exchanged glances, the kind shared by people who have just witnessed an unexpected coup. To my right, the young Latina American secretary tried to keep her composure. Her head bowed over her notes, though her hand trembled, and her handwriting slanted sharply. I saw everything, every deep breath, every slow blink, every smallest movement. In this room, I was the only one truly calm. Calm, because I had waited far too long for this moment. My son's voice broke the silence, hoarse and uneven. "Mom, what did you just say?" I tilted my head slightly, eyes never leaving his face. "You heard me. This company now belongs to me, and from this moment forward I will decide everything." I could hear his heartbeat, or maybe it was just the blood pounding in my ears from the adrenaline. Around us, chairs creaked as shareholders leaned forward, eager to catch every word. His lips moved. Then he let out a short laugh, empty of any amusement. "Mom, you don't have the money to buy this company. This isn't a few shares from a small exchange. This is an entire corporation." I didn't answer right away. I let the question hang in the air, letting everyone feel the weight of the silence. Then deliberately, I slid a file toward him. The sound of paper against wood was so sharp that someone flinched. Inside was everything: the stock transfer documents, the board's resolutions, legal confirmations from a Manhattan law firm. All legitimate, all irreversible. He stared at each page, his eyes scanning the numbers, the words, then stopping at the signatures. His and mine side by side, like two opposing milestones in a long story. Why would you do this?" he asked, lifting his gaze to me. For the first time, I saw not just anger in his eyes, but the faintest crack of fear. I turned my chair slightly, looking out the floor-to-ceiling window. Below New York's morning rush flowed people and cars, moving like blood through veins that never stopped. I used to love this city for its energy. Now I loved it for its coldness and ruthlessness, the very things that had taught me how to survive. Turning back, I locked eyes with him. Because some debts are not measured in money. No one spoke. In that silence, a fountain pen slipped from a shareholder's hand, hitting the tile floor, the metallic clink landing like an exclamation mark on our exchange. I drew a deep breath, then tapped my fingers 3 times on the table, an old habit whenever I wanted to close one chapter and begin another. "All right, let's begin the meeting with the new chairwoman." And so, under the cold white light, beneath a web of stairs laced with shock, respect, and curiosity, I stepped fully into the role I had been preparing for months. I don't know how the others in that room will remember that moment, but for me it was the only time in my life when every second of waiting, every endurance, every bitter swallow had been worth it. I remember that afternoon, vividly late autumn, when the golden sunlight drifted gently through the kitchen window of my home in New Jersey. My son had come to visit, carrying a bottle of red wine and a bag of toasted bread from my favorite bakery. I didn't know if it was thoughtful planning or just coincidence, but everything about that day moved slowly, wrapped in an unusual warmth. We sat across from each other at the dining table with an English silver teapot between us, the same one I had kept since my days living in California. He didn't drink tea. He only took a small sip before setting the cup down. his gaze fixed on me as if he were about to open a door to a bigger conversation. Mom, I have an incredible opportunity, but I need more capital to take the company to the next level. I smiled, folded my napkin, and asked, "What kind of opportunity?" And so he began to paint the picture: a market expansion campaign, a chain of major contracts, and IPO within 3 years. Every sentence of his was dusted with a fine layer of sugar. He spoke with the full confidence of youth, with the eagerness of someone standing at the edge of a great dream. Then he lowered his voice, looking deep into my eyes. "Give me your apartment, and I'll take care of you. You'll never have to worry about anything again. Just trust me." I froze for a few seconds. The apartment he spoke of was the one I had lived in for more than a decade, a Manhattan penthouse bought with years of tireless work and saving. It was worth over $1 million, not only because of its prime location, but because every brick, every pane of glass was a testament to my life's effort. I knew that in America, property was the guarantee for one's old age, the anchor, when health no longer allowed you to earn. But I also knew that in America, chances for quick fortune could appear and vanish like the wind, and I wanted to believe my son was seizing one of those rare gusts. I looked at him and saw the boy he once was, sitting on the floor piecing together a puzzle, patiently fitting each piece. I remembered when he first graduated, failed with his first startup, yet still smiled and said, "I'll try again. Don't worry, Mom." Trust, I realized, is not born in a single moment. It is built over years through every hug, every word of encouragement, every time I stood in the audience cheering for my child. "I trust you," I said. He took my hand and squeezed it gently. I saw the radiant joy in his eyes, as though he had just been handed a ticket to the express train toward success. A week later, I signed the papers to transfer the apartment. My signature trembled slightly, not from hesitation, but because I was placing in it everything I had. Not just money, but my absolute trust in my son. When I stepped out of the lawyer's office, I paused to look up at the Manhattan sky. It was an unusually clear, bright blue, as if it wanted to herald something good. I didn't know that with that signature, I had also opened the door to the most bitter and humiliating days of my life. I used to think signing the papers to sell my apartment was just a formality, a small step toward a bigger future for the both of us. But the day I sat in the lawyer's office to put pen to paper, I realized just how badly my hand was trembling. The room was on the 20th floor of an office building in Midtown Manhattan. Outside the window, the city roared on cars, weaving through the endless maze like tiny shuttles. But inside, it was so quiet, I could hear the fountain pen gliding over the paper, the ink sinking into the white sheets of the documents. The lawyer handed me a thick stack of papers marking the spots that needed my signature with neon stickers. I glanced at my son, seated across from me. He smiled at me, a confident, reassuring smile. A smile I had seen thousands of times since he was a child. A smile that had always made me believe. I signed. Page after page, each signature was like an unspoken promise: "I trust you." When it was done, the lawyer stood, shook our hands, and offered a few words of congratulations. I stepped into the hallway where the afternoon sunlight poured through the large glass panes. I clutched my handbag, feeling a strange mix of relief and excitement. In my mind, the future stretched wide before me, a place where I would see my son running a successful company, and I would simply enjoy a peaceful old age. But a few months later, things began to change. At first, he still called me every week. His voice was bright, full of stories about new contracts and potential partners. I listened, smiled, and felt reassured that I had done the right thing. But then the calls became less frequent, once every 2 weeks, then once a month. I began to see scattered news in the financial papers: his company struggling with cash flow loans, tightening stock prices, slipping. I called to ask, but he brushed it off. "It's nothing, Mom. Don't worry." Then one day I received a letter from the bank. It was brief: the apartment had been mortgaged, and due to missed payments, the bank would proceed with foreclosure. I read it again and again, hoping I had misunderstood. But no, everything was clear. I called my son immediately. There was a pause on the other end before he answered. "Mom, I'm sorry. I had to use the apartment as collateral for a loan. But now, things aren't going as planned, I asked. So, where's the apartment now? He sighed. Mom, you're on your own. Just 4 words. 4 words like a cold blade slicing into my chest. I sat down at the kitchen chair, feeling as though the air had been drained from my lungs. I had raised him, trusted him, given him everything. And now everything was gone in a single sentence. The apartment wasn't just where I lived. It was where we had celebrated warm Christmases together, where the living room walls were lined with photos of his father and of him from childhood to adulthood. It was where I had thrown open the windows on spring mornings to let in the wind and the bird song. It was memory. It was proof of a lifetime of effort. And now it was no longer mine. I didn't cry. Not because I was strong, but because I was too stunned for tears. The weeks that followed were long and gray. I moved into a small rental in Queens, much cheaper. The living room was barely big enough for a small sofa set and an old bookshelf. I packed the family photos into a box, because hanging them on the walls here only made me miss the old place more. Every evening, I sat by the window and looked out at the street. The yellow streetlights, the sound of buses, the distant wail of car horns. I thought about the words my son had said, the promises I had believed. The bitterness wasn't just from losing the home. The bitterness came from realizing that the person you trusted most was the one who pushed you into the dark, from knowing you had become invisible in their life as if your existence was nothing but a burden. I began avoiding old friends. I didn't want to answer questions about the apartment, about my son's company, about the good life they thought I was living. I stayed silent. I locked the pain inside where no one could touch it. But in that silence, a small flame began to flicker. I didn't know what it was at first, maybe pride, maybe survival instinct. But it made me start watching more closely. I read every news article about my son's company, missing no detail. Quietly, I took notes. Quietly, I reached out to the people I still knew in the industry. Bitterness, if kept long enough, turns into fuel. And I, a mother who seemed to have lost everything, began to learn how to use that bitterness as the fuel for my plan. After leaving the Manhattan apartment, I moved into a small room in Queens. It wasn't exactly terrible, but compared to the spacious, sun-filled home I once had, this was a completely different world. The room was barely large enough for a single bed, a small table, and a wardrobe whose door hung slightly off its hinge. The window overlooked a narrow alley where the rumble of delivery trucks rolled past even in the dead of night. When it rained, damp, chilly air seeped through the window frame, carrying with it the smell of mildew. I arranged my belongings, but there was so little. The family photos stayed in their boxes. I didn't want to hang them up. I was afraid that every glance would show me another version of myself, a woman who once had everything, and then lost it all. By day, I worked part-time at a small grocery store owned by an acquaintance. I stood at the counter, stocked shelves, and sometimes chatted with customers. They knew nothing about me, nothing about my past, and I didn't tell them. In a city like New York, everyone is too busy with their own stories. No one cares who you are unless you tell them. In the evenings, I returned to the small room, eating a quick meal, a bowl of soup, or a packet of instant noodles. Some nights, I simply sat by the window, watching the yellow streetlights blur on the pavement, listening to the distant fade of car horns. This city had once given me so many opportunities, and it was this same city that had witnessed every one of my downfalls. I still sometimes saw my son's face on online news at lavish parties, surrounded by familiar faces from the business world. He smiled brightly, champagne glass raised, as if nothing in this world could touch him. Those images stung. Not because he was living well, but because he was living well without remembering me. In those glittering frames, I was no longer part of the story. Once I happened to run into an old friend at the subway station. She asked, "I heard your son is doing very well. How about you?" I forced a smile. "I'm fine." That was all. I said nothing more. I didn't want anyone to see the truth that the mother who had proudly handed her son $1 million apartment was now living in a cheap rented room, working an hourly job. The worst bitterness wasn't losing the house. It wasn't losing the money. The worst bitterness was the feeling of being left behind. Every morning when I woke up, I wondered if he ever thought of me. 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 If he ever thought of if he ever remembered the day I signed over the apartment to him, or if he had locked that memory away in some old drawer, never to be opened again. Some nights I dreamed I was back in the old apartment. The kitchen lights were on, the smell of baked bread in the air, and his voice calling out, "Mom, come have dinner with me." But as I walked toward him, everything blurred, then vanished. I woke to the dark ceiling and the sound of rain at the window. And it was in that darkness that I began to realize one thing: I could not live like this forever. I had been through too much to let my story end in a cramped room, quietly waiting for time to pass. I began reading the news about my son's company again. Every article, every financial update. I started spotting warning signs I had overlooked before: falling revenue, rising debt, major partners withdrawing. Each time I saw another red number in the financial reports, it felt like a new puzzle piece falling into my hands. Slowly, a picture began to form: that company was standing on a slippery slope, and all it would take was one misstep for it to fall. I wasn't happy about it, but I couldn't deny I saw an opportunity. One winter evening, as heavy snow fell, I sat in my small room with a steaming cup of tea and my battered old laptop. I opened the stock ticker and saw my son's company shares drop to their lowest point in 3 years. My heart beat faster, not from worry, but from the thought that flashed in my mind. If I bought shares right now? I knew I didn't have much money. But I also knew that in a city like New York, fortune sometimes arrived in the form of opportunities everyone else had overlooked. And I had spent my life making sure I never missed one. Bitterness can eat a person alive. But if you learn to use it, it becomes a special kind of strength, one that makes you patient, meticulous, and ready to wait for the perfect moment. I began looking for the deed to a piece of land in my hometown, the only asset I still owned outright. It lay on the outskirts of a small town in Pennsylvania, left to me by my parents. For years, I hadn't touched it, treating it as a memory rather than an investment. But now I saw it differently. It wasn't just land, it was my ticket back to the board. I knew that when the time came, I wouldn't miss my move. And I also knew that when I returned, I wouldn't just be a mother who had been abandoned. I would be the one holding the power. I don't know when I started waking up earlier than before. Perhaps it was the day I realized that news about my son's company was appearing regularly in the finance section. Every morning, I brewed a cup of black tea, opened my battered old laptop with its loose hinge, and sat at the small table by the window. The morning light filtered through the gap in the curtains, laying a pale gold wash over the worn keys. I read every article, every quarterly financial report. Numbers speak, and I had begun to hear their voices declining: revenue shrinking, profits steadily rising, short-term debt. Occasionally, the press would sprinkle in rumors: a lost major client here, a delayed project there. To outsiders, these might look like temporary setbacks. But I, someone who had once quietly watched this company come into being, knew these were cracks spreading fast. Once the foundation weakens, all it takes is a strong gust, and the whole thing will come down. I took no pleasure in seeing my son falter. Even though he had abandoned me, a part of me still wished for his success. But I also knew opportunities rarely knock twice, and this time the opportunity wasn't knocking. It was standing right outside my door, waiting for me to open it. I began calling a few old friends from the industry. They were surprised to hear my voice after so many years, but when I asked about the market, they answered readily. The stock price for that company has tanked. If anyone's got the guts, now's the time to buy in, because if it bounces back, the profit will be huge. I smiled. I didn't just have guts. I had a reason. That evening, I opened the small metal box under my bed and pulled out a file whose pages had yellowed with time. It was the deed to a plot of land in the outskirts of a small town in Pennsylvania, the only asset left untouched after everything else. The land had once belonged to my parents. When they passed away, I kept it as a memory. Many had offered to buy it over the years, but I always said no. To me, it wasn't just a piece of property, it was a piece of childhood summers, spent running barefoot through the grass afternoons on the porch, listening to cicadas sing. But memories don't pay bills, and memories don't put you back in the game. I placed the file on the table, smoothed a hand over the first page, and called a real estate broker I once knew. "I want to sell the land," I said plainly. There was a pause. "Are you sure land prices there are good right now?" But I remember you once said you'd never sell. This time is different, I replied, and I knew my voice carried no trace of hesitation. A week later, I was at a lawyer's office in Pennsylvania, signing the sale documents. A small room, a polished wooden desk, the faint scent of fresh paper and printer ink. I sat upright, my hand steady as I held the pen, no trembling like the day I signed away the Manhattan apartment. Each signature was a decision made with clear calculation. I was no longer the mother blindly trusting her son. I was a new player on the board, and I knew exactly where this move would take me. When I put the pen down on the final page, I looked at my hands. The same hands that had once held my son's to help him cross the street, the same hands that had sliced his birthday cake. Now they were preparing for a move that could change the entire story. The money from the sale went straight into my account. The number on the screen made me hold my breath for a few seconds. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to start my plan. I didn't rush into buying shares. I watched for a few more weeks, waiting for the price to hit bottom. And when it did, I bought small lots quietly so no one would notice. I spread the purchases across different brokerage firms. I didn't want my son or his inner circle to realize his mother was slowly becoming a major shareholder. Day by day, my percentage grew. Each time I finished a purchase, I'd close the laptop, sip my tea, and feel as though I'd placed another chess piece exactly where it needed to be. Once I met an old friend at a small cafe near Central Park. When she heard I was investing in my son's company, she was astonished. "You're trying to save him?" I smiled, took a sip of coffee, and said, "No, I'm trying to save myself." That entire winter, I kept collecting shares. I wasn't in a hurry, patience was my greatest advantage now. And as I predicted, the stock price stayed stuck, showing no signs of recovery. I wasn't just buying. I was gathering information. I knew who was looking to sell because they'd lost faith. I knew which contracts had been canceled, which projects were stalled. All of it was part of the puzzle for my next move. One early spring morning, I received an email from the law firm. The subject line was short: "Confirmation, you are now the largest shareholder." I sat still for a few seconds. Sunlight streamed through the window, glinting off the laptop screen, making the words glow like an affirmation. I leaned back in my chair and let out a long breath. Months of quiet watching, waiting, calculating, had finally brought me here. I knew that from this moment, I was just one step away from taking the chair my son was sitting in. And when that happened, the first thing I would say to him would be, "Son, this company now belongs to me." I sat at the head of the table, the chair still new, the faint scent of leather lingering in the cold air of the boardroom. In front of me, a polished metal nameplate gleamed, engraved clearly, "Chairwoman, Evelyn M. Carter." My son sat a few meters away in the seat that had been his just a week ago. The overhead LED lights poured down onto his face, exposing every rigid line etched by shock. He stood. The chair scraped backward with a piercing screech that tore through the pin-drop silence. His eyes locked on mine, a gaze laced with fear-confusion, and a hint of disbelief. "Mom, what is this?" His voice was hoarse, as if he'd just swallowed a lump of ice. I didn't answer right away. I wanted him to feel every second of this moment. I drew in a slow breath, then spoke deliberate and measured. "From now on, I'm in charge. And no, I didn't do this for revenge. I just want you to understand. Some things once lost can never be regained." I saw his shoulders tremble. One shareholder to his left glanced at me, their eyes a mix of curiosity and respect. They had once thought I was just a retired mother, but now they knew I was the one who had quietly turned the entire board in my favor. The secretary placed a folder in front of me. I opened it, my first decisions, as the new chair, restructuring the staff, cutting wasteful expenses, renegotiating loss-making contracts. With each page I turned, I could feel my son's eyes following my every move. Perhaps he was searching for a crack, a lifeline to reverse this. But here in this room, he was no longer the one making the rules. An older shareholder seated in the corner spoke up. "Mrs. Carter, we're ready to support the new decisions." I nodded and made a note. It wasn't just an endorsement, it was a public declaration that my side had won. I turned to my son. You'll still stay in the company, but from today, you'll be in a different position. No more signing authority, no more budget approvals. You'll learn to run things from the ground up instead of from the top down. He clenched his jaw. I heard the grind of teeth, but he said nothing. Maybe he knew that any outburst now would only make him lose face further. I thought of everything that had brought me here, the cold mornings in Queens, the cups of tea beside my battered laptop, the carefully split share purchases so I wouldn't be noticed. All of it culminating in this moment. I didn't need to raise my voice or speak cutting words. The silent power of truth was doing it for me. After a while, the meeting moved on to other matters. I chaired with a calm, concise tone, pausing to seek the shareholders' input, listening and making notes. I wanted them to see I wasn't here just to defeat my son, but to lead for real. My son stayed quiet occasionally, glancing at his phone. But I knew he wasn't paying attention. His whole posture betrayed it. Hunched shoulders, clenched fists, lips pressed into a thin line. When the meeting ended, people rose from their seats. Some shareholders shook my hand. Others simply nodded, but their eyes had changed. Gone was the skepticism, replaced with recognition. My son still stood in place, as if unsure whether to leave or speak. I packed my papers into my leather bag, then stepped toward him. Placing my hand lightly but firmly on his shoulder, I said, "Son, this isn't the end for you. This is your chance to learn the value of what you have, before you lose it. I'm not here to destroy you. I'm giving you back the lesson I once taught you, the one you forgot." He looked up, his eyes glossy, yet still proud. And in them I saw a storm of emotions, anger, confusion, and somewhere deep, the faint recognition of his mistakes. I left the boardroom first. Outside, the deep blue carpeted hallway led to the large glass doors where the midday light poured in. I walked slowly each step, feeling like I was leaving behind a chess match I had already won. The elevator doors opened. I stepped in. As they closed, I allowed myself for the first time in years to truly smile. Not the kind that kept up appearances, not polite courtesy, but the smile of someone who knew every sacrifice, every wait, every bitter swallow, had finally found its answer. Deep down, I knew this wasn't just satisfaction. It was release. I was no longer haunted by the words, "You're on your own, Mom." I had managed on my own. And not just for myself, I had taken care of this company too. But I also knew that while power could be reclaimed, family bonds were not so easily restored. A part of me still hoped that after everything my son would understand. And if that day came, I would be ready not as a chairwoman, but as a mother. The revolving glass doors of the office building closed behind me, shutting out the noise of the boardroom, the curious stares, the congratulatory handshakes, the tension of victory. Outside, the late afternoon New York air carried a trace of October chill, not biting just enough to make you pull your coat a little closer. I stood on the sidewalk and looked up. Between the skyscrapers, the sunset bled gold and orange across the glass facades, turning the whole city into a fleeting, radiant painting. In the distance, I could almost see the place where years ago my penthouse sat on the top floor of a building overlooking Central Park. I still remembered the view from that balcony in autumn. The park below was like a vast golden carpet. In winter, snow blanketed every winding path, and on Christmas Eve, the lights sparkled like fallen stars. That apartment had never been just a place to live, it was a piece of my life. Now it belonged to someone else. Perhaps they were sitting in the living room with a glass of wine or laughing at the dining table where I used to place fresh flowers every Saturday morning. The thought made my chest tighten. I began to walk, blending into the city's rush hour flow. New York at this hour was a chaotic symphony, car horns, heels, striking pavement, people calling out to each other in haste. Everyone had somewhere to be. So did I, but unlike theirs, my destination wasn't a bar or a family dinner. Mine was a small rented room in Queens with cold, white-painted walls and a window overlooking a narrow alley. I knew I had reclaimed the money. I had reclaimed my dignity. But the bond between mother and son, that was a void no victory could fill. When you lose something material, you can find a way to replace it. But when you lose trust, that invisible thread woven over a lifetime, you realize there's no investment in the world that can buy it back. When my son was little, every time he stumbled, he would run to me for comfort. Now the distance between us wasn't measured in miles, but in years of silence and words left unsaid. I turned into a small cafe near the train station. Inside, the rich smell of roasted coffee mingled with the soft hum of jazz. I ordered a cappuccino and chose a table by the window. From there, I could watch people of all ages pass by a young couple hand in hand, a middle-aged man in a suit rushing into a taxi, an elderly woman pushing a cart full of paper bags. I realized each one carried their own story, joys, losses, things no outsider would ever truly know. Perhaps my story was just one among the millions this city witnessed every day. But to me, it was everything. When the cappuccino arrived, I looked at the smooth foam on top. The rising steam blurred the scene outside the way. Memories sometimes fade with time. But no matter how blurred, some images refused to disappear my son's eyes on the day I signed the apartment over to him, his voice saying, "You're on your own, Mom," and the way he looked at me this morning when he realized I was sitting in his chair. I took a sip. Bitter, but a bitterness far easier to bear than the taste of betrayal. I didn't know what would become of our relationship. Maybe we'd recover some small part of that broken thread. Maybe it would stay as polite, distant meetings at company events. Or maybe one day he would knock on my door not as a CEO, but as my son. I wanted to believe in that last possibility, but I also knew life rarely gives us the ending we wish for. Night was falling. I paid, pulled on my coat, and stepped back into the street. The streetlights blinked on stretching people's shadows into long smudges on the pavement. I walked to the station, joining the crowd, waiting for the next train. When it arrived, I found a seat by the window. The city slid away behind me, its lights melting into blurred gold specks. I leaned my head against the glass and exhaled slowly. Today's victory wasn't complete, but it was proof that I hadn't let myself be broken. I had stood up, kept walking, and reclaimed my place. And even with that emptiness still inside me, I knew I would go on, not as a victim, but as someone who had learned to own her story. And somewhere in the steady rhythm of the train, I whispered to myself, I can take back the money. I can take back my dignity. But the bond between mother and son, that is a void nothing can fill.